Welcome in, everybody. Get ready for a deep dive into Bristol during the swinging 60s. Wow, look at this. Articles, photos, first-hand accounts. We've got quite a journey ahead of us. We'll be exploring Concord, those iconic bands that rocked the city, and the huge transformation Bristol went through. But we'll also be looking at the other side of the story, the fight for equality and the impact of global events on life in Bristol.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that Bristol in the 60s was more than just following trends. It was a microcosm of those massive shifts happening across Britain. Technology, social change, the whole shebang.
Right, so let's kick things off with Bristol's physical transformation. The sources describe a city exploding with new construction, buildings popping up everywhere, motorways cutting through the landscape, and the Broadmead shopping area becoming the place to be.
It's really interesting how these changes mirror what was happening in post-war Britain, a push for modernization and a real desire to embrace the future. Take those high-rise flats, for instance. They weren't just about providing housing, they reflected how people's lives and aspirations were changing.
It's kind of funny to imagine what it must have been like, moving into those new high-rises. Were people excited? Or maybe a bit nervous about leaving behind the old ways?
Probably a mix of both, I'd say. And that's what makes this era so fascinating. It was a time of huge change and adjustment as people navigated all the new stuff happening around them.
And speaking of reaching new heights, we can't forget Concorde. Built right there in Filton, this supersonic jet became a symbol of Bristol's ambition and technological prowess. But did Concorde's development impact Bristol beyond just civic pride?
That's a great question. Concord wasn't just a symbol, it was a driver of economic and social change. Building it created tons of jobs and attracted skilled workers to the city. It also put Bristol on the map for technological innovation, bringing in investment and fostering the sense of being at the forefront of progress.
So Concorde wasn't just a cool plane. It was a catalyst for Bristol's growth and global reputation. It's amazing how one technological marvel could have such a huge ripple effect.
Absolutely. And those ripples extended to everyday life. The sources mention a boom in other industries during this period: aerospace, food and tobacco, printing. These industries provided jobs and put money in people's pockets, which led to a surge in consumer spending.
Now I'm thinking about all those new consumer goods that were becoming more common. Cars, televisions, washing machines, things we take for granted today.
Right, but back then these things were symbols of prosperity and a changing lifestyle, and they also fueled a shift in how people spent their free time. Imagine, you have a car now and more free time. What are you going to do?
You hit the open road, maybe take a trip across that newly opened Severn Bridge. That must have been a game changer for Bristol, connecting it to Wales in a way that was never possible before.
Exactly. The Severn Bridge wasn't just about convenience, it was a symbol of progress and connection on a national scale. This was a time when infrastructure development was seen as key to economic growth and national integration, not just in Britain, but globally.
But as we explore this era of progress and excitement, we also need to look at the issues bubbling beneath the surface, like the inequalities that led to the Bristol bus boycott.
This is where those complexities of the 1960s really come into focus. The bus boycott is a perfect example of how social change often comes from challenging the status quo.
So the Bristol Omnibus Company had this policy of not hiring Black or Asian people as drivers or conductors. I mean, was that even legal back then? It seems unbelievable now.
We have to understand the context. Britain in the 60s was still dealing with the legacy of colonialism and widespread racial prejudices. While those hiring practices might seem shocking now, they were sadly a reality for many minority groups back then. The bus boycott was a direct response to those systemic inequalities.
Inspired by Rosa Parks' act of defiance in America, the people of Bristol decided to hit the bus company where it hurt their profits. They organized a boycott that lasted for 4 long months. And it wasn't just activists. It was students, politicians, everyday people, a whole city united against injustice.
And the impact was huge. The boycott wasn't just about getting Black and Asian people hired, it became the symbol of resistance against racial discrimination. It was a message that went way beyond Bristol, forcing Britain to confront its own deep-seated issues.
And the bus company eventually gave in, right?
They did. Rabir Singh became Bristol's first non-white bus conductor, a landmark victory for the boycott and a symbol of progress. But it went even further. It paved the way for the Race Relations Act of 1965, which outlawed racial discrimination in public places.
That's incredible. So the actions of individuals in Bristol helped spark nationwide change.
Exactly. But it's also important to remember that the fight for equality didn't end there. The St. Paul's riots in 1980 sadly show that racial tensions and frustrations continued even after the success of the bus boycott. It's a reminder that social change is a process and that the echoes of the past can last for decades. It's interesting how those tensions show that the swinging 60s weren't just about having fun and fashion, it was also a time of so much social and political change, even in a place like Bristol.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the miniskirts and rock and roll, but there was a lot more going on. The sources mention all those legendary hangouts like the Glen nightclub, the Locarno Ballroom, even the Wimpy on Union Street. What was the role of those places in Bristol's 60s scene?
Those venues were more than just places to eat or dance. They were social hubs where people could connect, express themselves, try new things. The Glen, for example, was known for its music and attracted a very diverse crowd, while the Locarno Ballroom hosted everything from ballroom dancing to rock concerts.
It's amazing to think about all the conversations that must have happened in those places, the friendships, the memories. They weren't just venues, they were little worlds reflecting Bristol's social fabric.
And that fabric was changing with the Cultural Revolution happening across the West. This youth-driven movement was challenging norms, embracing individuality, and looking for new forms of expression, especially through music.
Speaking of music, Bristol had some huge bands playing there in the 60s. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones. The sources even say that the Rolling Stones kick off their first tour at the Corn Exchange. Can you imagine being there for that?
The Corn Exchange was like a musical melting pot. It hosted those iconic bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but also acts like Cream, Pink Floyd, Van Morrison. It wasn't just about entertainment, it was about a cultural shift, a new generation finding its voice.
Did Bristolians have a favorite local band or artist they were particularly proud of? Someone who really captured the city's vibe?
While there wasn't one specific artist who embodied Bristol's 60s sound, the city was full of local bands experimenting with different genres: rock, blues, folk, psychedelic music. The sources talk about venues like the Bamboo Club, known for its diverse lineup and inclusive atmosphere.
The Bamboo Club sounds really interesting. The sources mention it was owned by Tony Bullimore, who passed away a few years ago.
Bullimore was a bit of a legend around here. He loved music and created a space where everyone could come together and enjoy it. The Bamboo Club even hosted Bob Marley, which says a lot about its openness to different musical styles and cultures.
It sounds like the Bamboo Club was a real hidden gem, where musical boundaries didn't matter and creativity thrived. It wasn't just music, though, right? The 60s saw this creative burst across all art forms: fashion, film, literature. It was like a collective awakening.
Absolutely. It was a time for breaking away from tradition and pushing the limits of art. Think about fashion, the miniskirts, the bright colors, those psychedelic patterns. It was all about a generation throwing out old rules and embracing a new sense of freedom and individuality.
It wasn't just about looking cool. It was about making a statement. It was about challenging norms and expressing oneself in a way that was completely new. Did Bristol have any particular fashion trends or designers that stood out?
Well, London might have been the center of 60s fashion, but Bristol wasn't far behind. The city had its own boutiques and department stores where you could find the latest trends. The sources mention that fashion in Bristol was a mix of high-end and do-it-yourself, with people often making their clothes unique.
So it was this blend of national trends and that distinct Bristol flair. It seems like this spirit of challenging conventions and pushing boundaries was happening in other art forms too, right?
Definitely. In film, directors like Stanley Kubrick and Federico Fellini were creating groundbreaking movies that changed storytelling. And in literature, authors like Sylvia Plath and Philip K. Dick were exploring deep human experiences in new and sometimes unsettling ways.
It was a time of huge artistic and cultural change, going against the status quo and reimagining what was possible. But this wasn't happening in isolation, right?
Yeah.
It was all connected to those social and political movements, like the Civil Rights Movement and the protests against the Vietnam War.
You're absolutely right. The art, the music, the fashion, it was all part of this larger movement for change. It was rejecting the old ways and embracing new possibilities. And Bristol, with its rich artistic history and diverse communities, was the perfect place for this creative and social change.
So even in Bristol, global events were influencing people and sparking local activism. Were there any particular protests or demonstrations in the city related to these issues?
The sources mention that Bristol was definitely part of that wave of activism happening globally. There were protests against the Vietnam War, marches for civil rights, and a growing awareness of things like nuclear disarmament and protecting the environment. It shows that Bristol wasn't just focused on its own cultural revolution, it was also engaging with those broader social and political changes happening worldwide.
It's amazing how those global issues could resonate in a place like Bristol, sparking conversations, debates, and action. It shows that even though the 60s might seem like a long time ago, the themes of that time, social justice, political engagement, creative expression, are still relevant today.
They are, and it reminds us that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding what shaped our present and what continues to influence our future.
We've been talking about those big cultural and social changes, but what was it like to actually live in Bristol during the 60s? What kind of jobs did people have? How did they spend their free time? What were their worries and hopes for the future?
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, but it's the individual stories that really make history come alive. So let's focus on those daily experiences of Bristolians in this era.
Okay, so we've talked about these big cultural and societal shifts, but what was it actually like to live in Bristol during the 60s? Did everyone have a record player spinning the Beatles? Were homes decked out in avocado green and orange?
Well, not quite. The 60s did bring a wave of new trends and all those cool consumer goods, but we can't forget that not everyone experienced those changes in the same way. We have to think about the economic realities of the time. Some families were enjoying more prosperity, but others were still struggling. The sources point out that those modern conveniences like televisions and washing machines, they weren't available to everyone right away.
Right. It's a good reminder that even during a period of progress and change, people have different experiences. But I imagine that even with those differences, there was still a strong sense of community in Bristol.
Oh, absolutely. Community ties were especially strong in those working class neighborhoods. People depended on each other, they shared resources, celebrated together. It wasn't just about living in the same area, it was this shared identity, a feeling of belonging to a certain place and time.
The sources mention those local pubs and social clubs. What role did they play in everyday life? I'm guessing they were more than just places to grab a drink.
They were essential to the social fabric of Bristol. Those pubs weren't just about drinking, they were like community centers, places for entertainment, places to connect with friends and neighbors. Imagine local bands playing, people dancing, sharing stories, making connections that could last a lifetime.
That sounds so great. It's a glimpse into a time when those community connections were so important. Did families tend to stay in Bristol for generations, or was there a lot of movement in and out of the city?
That's a good question. Bristol definitely had its share of families with deep roots there, but the 60s were also a time when people were moving around more. People were moving for jobs, for education, or even just for a change of scenery. All those new residents brought new ideas and added to the city's changing identity.
It must have been really interesting to see that blend of old and new, the traditional ways of life mixing with those emerging trends and new ideas.
Exactly. And that back and forth between tradition and change is what makes this era so captivating. It wasn't a sudden shift, it was a gradual process, adapting and evolving.
We've talked about those music venues, but
Yeah.
what about other forms of leisure and entertainment? What did Bristolians do for fun on a typical weekend?
Well, you could catch a film at the Odeon Cinema, maybe go bowling, or spend an evening dancing at the Locarno Ballroom. And for those who wanted something a bit more relaxed, there were parks and green spaces where families could just hang out and enjoy the outdoors. It was a time when people were finding new ways to enjoy their free time, embracing both the traditional and the modern ways of having fun.
It's amazing how those everyday activities can tell us so much about a particular time and place.
They do. And it's important to remember that even with all those exciting social and cultural changes, there were anxieties and uncertainties too. The world was changing in so many ways. The Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. These weren't just things people read about in the news, they were shaping how people saw the world, sparking conversations around dinner tables and in those pubs across Bristol.
So even in a place that seemed idyllic, like Bristol, those global events were having an impact, making people think about the future. It must have been a time of both excitement and worry.
It was. And those mixed emotions are reflected in the sources you've shared. There's this optimism about what the future holds, but also a recognition of the challenges and uncertainties that lie ahead.
As we wrap up our deep dive into Bristol during the swinging 60s, I'm struck by how complex this era was. The energy, the innovation, the struggles, the triumphs. What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listener as they think about this time in Bristol's history?
I think the key takeaway is that the 60s were a period of massive transformation, not just for Bristol, but for the whole world. It was a time when old ways of thinking were challenged, new ideas came up, and the groundwork for the future was being laid. And what happened in that era, the fight for equality, the drive to innovate, the importance of community, it continues to shape Bristol today.
I love that. It's like the 60s are a mirror, showing us how far we've come and also reminding us of the work that still needs to be done.
Exactly. And as we deal with the complexities of our own time, it's helpful to look back at the 60s, not with rose-colored glasses, but with a critical eye, trying to understand how the lessons of that time can guide us toward a better future, a future that's more just, more fair, and full of creativity.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey back in time. We encourage you to keep exploring Bristol's history, discover those hidden stories, and connect with those echoes of the past that are still with us today. Until next time, keep diving deep.